So we are at number 3 of our 5-part series, Navigating Pain at School. Um, Tonight's webinar is about unlocking IEPs, how we can build a supportive education plan for your child. Um, so again, we're just really happy to have everybody here this evening. As we begin every session, we want to remind you that the content of this webinar is intended for educational purposes only, and that it is important to consult your own healthcare provider to address your child's specific needs and circumstances. So, I'm Amy Graham, and I'm the Executive Director of Migraine at School, and we have Casey Cashman here with us this evening as well, the Director of the U.S. Pain Pediatric Warrior Program. We are also so excited to have Maya Anderson back with us this evening, an education attorney with the Disability Law Center in Salt Lake City, and Elizabeth Henry Wire, who is the executive director of the Danielle Byron Henry Migraine Foundation. So Migraine at School is the foundational initiative of the Danielle Byron Henry Migraine Foundation. We are dedicated to supporting students living with migraine. We provide resources, education tools to help schools create an environment where every child can succeed, despite the challenges of managing chronic illness. And I just want to remind everybody before I prompt Casey, if you do have any questions as we move through, you can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So Casey, do you want to share with our group a little bit about the amazing work you do with the Pediatric Warrior Program?
I would love to. So first off, thank you guys for having us on here again. Maya, thank you for joining us again. The first in this series, the prior one to the series, you did such a phenomenal job, and I think so many people learned so much from it. So thank you for joining us again. So I am the director of the Pediatric Pain Warrior Program through the U.S. Pain Foundation, and our mission is to help empower, educate, support, and connect individuals who are living with chronic pain conditions or injuries that cause chronic pain. And we do that through several different programs. We do webinars, are one of our biggest adventures, I guess that I'm going to call it, is that we do offer a summer camp for individuals who are living with, for families in their my gosh, for families who are living with chronic pain conditions, we bring the whole family down to a summer camp, 5 days, 4 nights in San Antonio, Texas. So that will be rolling out hopefully here in the beginning of the year. It'll be our 4th year doing it. So we'll get you guys more information as well as support groups and us. Along with Migraine at School, co-host or collaborate on one for parents, and then we have one for teens as well, because peer-to-peer support is so important.
It really is. No, I mean, Casey, the work you do is phenomenal. Um, So I see that somebody raised their hand. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them into the Q&A, and we will have a whole time at the end where we will take questions. We will answer whatever it is that we can answer. Maya, who is has an incredible amount of expertise, will help guide us all through that. As we mentioned before, today is our third session in this 5-part series where we're going to be talking about IEPs. Um, if you happened to miss one of our previous webinars, whether it was the webinar on creating a healthcare plan for your school or understanding 504 plans, you can see both of those videos. You can either use the QR code, or Elizabeth has thrown a ton of links into the chat, and so you can find those there. Additionally, we still have 2 webinars left. One is a parent panel where we're going to hear from parents who have already navigated this whole system and hear about their experience. They're going to bring their expertise to the table so we can learn a little bit from them about what it has been like navigating this on the parent guardian side of the story. Then we will end the series with a workshop for your child, how to create their advocacy script, really empowering them to be able to speak up at school and get what they need and really feel confident in discussing their pain and what their needs are at school. So with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into um, some IEP stuff. So, IEPs, individualized education plans, are just really a crucial tool in supporting, a child that's living with pretty severe chronic pain. What's nice about an IEP is that these are customized accommodations and services. The plan is tailored to your child's specific needs, and that can include adjustments to their learning environment, additional breaks, flexibility in assignments. I mean, really, it's about creating a plan that works best for your child and what their needs are. You, as a parent or guardian, have rights, and I think it's really important to understand your rights as a parent during this process so that you can effectively advocate for your child's education needs. And some of those key rights that you have, the first is participation in IEP meetings. Parents and guardians can attend and even request additional meetings to discuss their child's needs. The second is independent evaluations. Sometimes the school will be doing an evaluation of your child, but you have the right to seek an outside evaluation, which the school must consider when working on the IEP. Consent and dispute resolution. Schools need parental consent for evaluations and services, and parents have the right to mediation or hearings if you disagree with the school's decision. And then we have educational placement options. In some cases, if the school fails to provide the necessary services, parents have the right to pursue alternative schooling options that is covered by the district. By the way, Maya, if I get any of these things wrong, please correct any of these things when we hand it over to you, please. Um, so the IEP evaluation process, understanding this process, sort of like from the eligibility, the evaluation to eligibility, it all feels really overwhelming. And that's why we're here this evening, is we really want to break this down step by step so that you as parents and guardians feel informed and so you have a better understanding of what qualifies a child for an IEP versus a 504, and understanding that can be somewhat challenging. Again, thankfully, we have somebody here this evening that understands this much better than we do and is an expert in this. We are so excited to have Maya Anderson with us again this evening. She brings a wealth of expertise to the table. She is an attorney with the Disability Law Center in Salt Lake City. For those of you who are joining us this evening or maybe watching this post live, this organization is not unique throughout the country. We learned in our 504 webinar that there are organizations like this in every state. We at Migraine at School are busy gathering all of that information, and we're going to have that up on our website moving into 2025. So if you're, say, in Ohio, you'll be able to figure out who it is that you need to call if you need someone like Maya to help advocate for you. So with that, we're going to go ahead and start the conversation this evening with Maya. Maya, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Course, yes, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy to help out and lend some of this funky knowledge wherever it may prove appropriate.
I mean, it's really important knowledge, and we're so glad that you have it. So, as we kind of begin this conversation, Maya, from your experience, what are some common challenges that families can face when they begin advocating for an IEP, especially in a case where you're dealing with chronic pain that isn't an invisible disability?
Sure, yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So, I would say that different places, different districts, and different states have different systemic issues that
Mhm.
come up more frequently. So there's a wide variety of situations that you can come up that you can come across when you're advocating for a student who's in this particular situation. But in my experience, a lot of the challenges that families face advocating for an IEP, especially if they've already been on a 504 or another kind of plan in the past, really stem from some negative perceptions, prejudices about what disability looks like and about what kids are like, I would say. We went into this a little bit in the Section 504 webinar previously, but we have this kind of perception that kids are devious and always trying to, get their way out of things and trying to trick people. I've heard people say, oh, kids, they're manipulative. They are always trying to brainwash you, sometimes even, some very strong language being used about that. And the fact of the matter is that kids are no more manipulative or devious than you or I are. And, we're all inclined to seek out pleasure and avoid pain. This is basic psychology stuff. And it's very much, not, a unique thing for students or for kids, people with disabilities, or, anybody to, occasionally try to seek out situations that minimize those negative stimuli, forgive me, and maximize the benefit, basically. So I see a lot of challenges that come from this perception of kids as being, devious, trying to get out of things, like the idea that an accommodation that is being provided is really just, it's an out, basically, like we're giving you a get out of class free card. We're not going to expect you to perform as much because you are just trying to get out of this because you don't want to do it. Sometimes I'll hear things like, kids have a bad attitude, or, this student just doesn't want to do the work. And I do think that there is a difference that is observable between, this kid just doesn't want to do the work versus this kid absolutely does want to do the work, but can't due to circumstances associated with their disability. So there's this kind of pervasive bootstrappy kind of mentality that I think still exists in a lot of school districts that think that, like, well, I had to do this back in my day with, the resource, with the shirt on my back and the resources in my own two hands, and everybody else should be able to do that too. This idea that, like, well, we all face challenges, why should you be so special? This lack of understanding that, the the circumstances and the struggles that people face due to disability is really on another level. It's not the same thing people are thinking of, when you think of, oh, the challenges that I had to face, growing up. Everybody does face these challenges, but the challenges faced by people with disabilities are of a particular nature. And, we have laws that are designed to protect people specifically because of that. We believe, especially as part of the disability advocacy community, that people with disabilities can and do succeed when they are provided with the supports that they need to make progress in whatever it is they're trying to achieve based on their individual circumstances. And that's sort of the core theme and message of the special education law, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in this country, is that we believe in people with disabilities. We believe in kids with disabilities, regardless of what that disability looks like. You have potential. Everyone has potential that they can make if they are provided with that support that they need. So I would say that, like, getting over that kind of hurdle, and sometimes you are, have the good fortune to be working with people who are, a little bit more competent, a little bit more trained, and, maybe don't have some of those mindsets. But I think by far the most common issue that I run into, both in the 504 and in the IEP, the special education context, and we'll get into the difference and the distinction between IEPs, 504s, and what special ed and related services are in a minute. But just those basic sort of things. What is this for? What is it that you're trying to achieve with this? you know, that idea that we're not trying to get something that other people don't get. We are trying to get the same benefit that everybody else takes for granted, basically.
Thank you. No, that I mean, well said. And you just mentioned sort of the, the sort of the difference as you start to figure out the difference between an IEP and a 504. So, when you're looking at a family who maybe is thinking that they need to pursue an IEP versus a 504 plan, what indicators do you think that family needs to sort of be looking out for when it's time to move to an IEP?
Yes, that's a very good question, one that comes up very frequently in presentations that I do on education law. People always want to, are wanting to know, what's the difference? Is a 504 the same thing as an IEP? What are the differences? Is one better than the other? So in order to, answer that question, of course, we need to know what is the difference between an IEP and a 504. So if you were at our previous webinar that we did with 504 plans, we talked about how a Section 504 plan is an accommodation plan. It specifically concerns reasonable accommodation. So if you've ever seen those blue signs with the wheelchair stick figure guy there, that's for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's sort of become the international symbol of accommodations, reasonable accommodations. And so when we talk about accommodations, we're talking about exactly what I just mentioned earlier, things that are, a change to some sort of program or service that doesn't fundamentally alter whatever it is that's being done, but allows somebody who has a disability to participate and receive the benefit of whatever that program or service is, and have an receive a benefit which is as adequate as that which non-disabled people receive. So a classic example of an accommodation in the educational context would be an increased amount of time to do tests. For instance, if you have a student who has a type of, let's say you have a student who has a learning disability in the area of reading and needs additional time to be able to do their, to read the prompt on their history test or something like that. The increased amount of time to take the test could be an accommodation. Accommodations run really a wide gamut, and there's a lot of things that can be considered accommodations. Accommodations can be physical. So if you have, a student who has a mobility impairment to be able to participate in PE, for instance, physical education, they might need some sort of specialized equipment to be able to play the games that the PE kids are doing. So that's kind of, a very like stereotypical example. But really the key is reasonable. So an accommodation is reasonable if it allows the person to participate and doesn't fundamentally alter the content of what's being provided or what's being done. So a student who needs to go to the bathroom and needs to have unlimited bathroom access due to a disability during class, that's generally going to be reasonable. It's not going to prevent the student from learning, if they're going to the bathroom, coming back and doing their work, as they should be. It doesn't need to be disruptive or anything like that. And maybe that student really needs that to be able to participate. And so a 504 plan, to summarize, contains accommodations. The biggest difference between a 504 plan and an IEP is when we start talking about special education. So special education is a term that comes up all over the place, of course, in education law. And it's important to know what it means and what it doesn't mean, basically. So the way that I like to explain it is specially designed instruction is curriculum modification, basically modifying the educational curriculum to meet the needs of a person with a disability. And that really is the key there. The actual content of the curriculum is what's being modified. So, we also call that specially designed instruction. That's the same idea. If the actual content of what you are teaching is actually changing or being presented in a completely different way, then that is approaching what we are going to call specially designed instruction or special education. So if you have a student who requires a different sort of math curriculum because they're really far behind, or maybe they just don't understand the way that math is taught normally, and you need to have a specialist that's going to come in and actually change and modify the assignments that are being provided, or the lessons themselves, so that it's actually, the curriculum itself is being changed in the way that it's being delivered, that is what would constitute special education. So special education is available under an IEP. It is not available under a Section 504 plan. So an IEP can contain everything that a Section 504 plan can contain, but the opposite is not necessarily true. So an IEP can have accommodations, an IEP can have testing accommodations, physical accommodations, homework accommodations, bathroom breaks, sensory breaks, whatever is considered to be reasonable. And, that's sort of a loaded legal term, so we won't go into that at the moment, but just keep in mind that accommodations have to be reasonable. But you're not able to get, if a student actually requires specially designed instruction to benefit from their education, that is not something that's available under a 504. And so the question here, when would you recommend somebody, if you think your student might need additional support, IEP versus 504, the question is really, does my student require more changes to the educational curriculum itself, or are the concerns that we have more focused around access to the environment itself? So are we just trying to access the classroom or access the assignment? We're doing the same sort of work that other kids are doing, but we just need, figuratively speaking, or maybe even literally, a step stool to be able to access that, to be able to access what the other students are doing. Or is it the actual content of the education that's being provided something that needs to be changed? Is your student really far behind to the point that they actually need a lower level curriculum or a change to the curriculum? Or is their disability such that they just simply require a different sort of teaching modality to be able to actually achieve a benefit? That's the key, is to be able to achieve a benefit, to be able to make appropriate educational progress. The benchmark is always going to be what a student needs to be able to achieve a benefit. And achieving a benefit means making progress, basically. So, and progress in turn is defined based on the student's individual needs. So any student who, the law says any student who requires specially designed instruction in order to make progress, in order to receive an educational benefit, what we call a free appropriate public education, a FAPE, F-A-P-E. If a student needs special ed in order to receive a FAPE, receive an educational benefit, make appropriate progress, and they fall under one of these various categories that the law lists, there's 13 different categories. Some states have added different ones. In Utah, we also have developmental delay as a category that applies just for kids who are of a certain age. If you fall under one of these categories and you require special ed in order to make progress, you are entitled to an IEP. And it is under, if you believe that your student does in fact require modified curriculum in order to make educational progress, then that's something that you should be considering. If your student is falling behind, I would say, if your student is falling behind and it's for any reason that's not immediately obvious, like your student can't get on the school bus to go there in the beginning of the day because the school is not sending a school bus, that's more of an accommodation. That's more, we're talking about access, basically. But if your student is just struggling and they've been in a general education class for months and months and months on end, and they're not making progress, maybe it's in one area like math. Math was always not, my worst subject when I was in school, or maybe reading or something else, or maybe across the board, they're not making progress if they're failing their classes, and there isn't any immediately obvious answer to that. It's not just the kid isn't showing up or isn't, trying. There's obviously something that's not, a connection that needs to be made here. That is when you would want to be looking at, does my student qualify for an IEP? And you have the right to request an IEP evaluation at any time. You can point to whatever justification, whatever evidence that you might have. That's always good to do. The school is required to, if they suspect there to be a disability that would require special education, specially designed instruction, they are required to proactively locate and evaluate that student, ensure that they're provided with an IEP if they are found eligible. So I guess to summarize, bring it back around, if your student is having problems that are very clearly educational in nature, that aren't really clearly explained by an issue of access or something more, obvious physically, or, something of that nature, or maybe it is, I don't want to say it's just, physical problems can, be IEP related, but I mean to say that if your student is not making educational progress and you think that the curriculum itself is the problem, that's when you're wanting to look at specially designed instruction. But that being said, the case under which that the situations that comes about don't always follow the stereotypical pattern. Like you might have a student who requires specially designed instruction because they have an intellectual disability and are very far behind the curriculum. Maybe they're on a much lower grade level of math and reading than the other students are on, and they require specially designed instruction due to that. Or maybe you have a student who doesn't have an intellectual disability, has a physical disability, and has missed a lot of school and is behind by virtue of that, or some other thing, limiting their focus is preventing them from accessing that education, and as a result they need a special specially designed instruction, special changes to their education curriculum. That's a situation that can and does happen as well. So it's good to remember there's a wide variety of situations where your student might require additional educational support and modification to make a benefit, and it's not just the kind of stereotypical or the most common kind of things that we think about. So it was a very, very long answer.
No, but it was a good answer.
It was a great answer.
I mean, again, Maya, this is like, we know that we can just sort of set up a prompt and you will just really explain the entirety of like what it is that we need to understand about the process. So, I mean, I thought that I already kind of had a good understanding of the two, but I definitely feel like I learned something just now. So like, thank you. Like, so
thank you.
And I think the other thing to remember, like with all of our kiddos here, right, is that we are all of those exceptions, right? We are not that easy blanket where they can just look at somebody and like everybody with migraine, everybody has the same accommodations, or everybody living with chronic pain has the exact same accommodations. And we are not our families are not those families, right? Like it would be great if they were. I think it would make all of our lives so much easier. So for families to hear that's great. So I guess that my question then would come from a family who maybe has had a 504 for a long time or a short time, whatever, but now they feel that they do need to transition into an IEP, right? Whether it's now they've missed so much school, they have fallen behind, or they realize that they need some extra benefits that they need to get from this. Like, what does that look like for them? Like, what is the starting point for them for that? Like, how do they go about that process when they finally made that decision?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm going to say this probably a number of times throughout this panel here today, and the folks from last time know what's coming. Everything should be in writing, always. It's going to be my lawyer answer. So the first thing that I would always recommend is that if you're going to make a request of any sort, whether that's for an evaluation, for a reevaluation, for a particular accommodation or a particular IEP service, or minutes of special education, regardless of what that is, I would highly recommend that all requests be made to a person who is in some position of administration, and that be in writing. And so if you have an administration who very much likes to talk to people on the phone, they like to get you on the phone to talk about stuff, and then there isn't much of a paper trail, you can still make sure that gets recorded by after you get off. I mean, first of all, if you live in Utah, and I won't speak to other states, but Utah is a one-party audio recording state, so you can record stuff. If you're a party to that conversation, you can record without mentioning it. Even if you don't do that, though, I would always recommend if you get off the phone with somebody, send them an email afterwards and say, hey, just to memorial, you don't have to say that necessarily, but just to cover, what we talked about on the phone just now. We discussed this, and this. I plan on doing this. You mentioned that you were going to do this. And that way, in the future, if you're going to come back and you need to point out like, hey, I made this request all the way back then and nobody followed up with me, you'll be able to show like that actually did happen. You can bring that up and have a paper trail. So that's before I even like launch into anything. I'm going to say that that's always going to be part of it. But yes, the starting point, if you're on a 504 and you're looking to get into an IEP, the starting point is generally going to be, you're going to make a formal request to the school for an evaluation for IEP services. So like I said before, the only thing that entitles you to an IEP is the need for specially designed instruction. and membership in one of these categories. Basically, the categories, though, I'll just say, since this is a the group focusing on migraine, the categories are probably a little bit overblown. It's very, very rare that you'll need specially designed instruction but not fall into one of those categories. In fact, I would say that situation is basically like nonsense. I can't think of a situation where you would require specially designed instruction but not somehow fall into one of these categories. They're not diagnoses. They don't line up with specific diagnoses. They're very broad. Migraine is generally going to fall under something like other health impairment, which is any sort of disability or health impairment that impacts your ability to focus, basically, or sit upright in your seat and be maintaining vitality. It's a very kind of classic old-timey word. So generally speaking, I would remember that OHI, other health impairment, if you have a student who has migraine or chronic pain condition of any sort, that's kind of a catch-all. Specific learning disability is another catch-all that will typically apply if nothing else does. Anyway, the important thing is to basically state that you feel that your student requires specially designed instruction. So in your initial email to the administrator, you want to say, I think that my student needs specially designed instruction, might qualify for an IEP. I'm requesting that we evaluate the student for an IEP. And it's really important that you say that like outright, not because there's any like legal danger that you'd get in. There's actually, the school is required to proactively evaluate students. So it's actually technically on the school. If they fail to evaluate a student, they fail to make progress. That's actually the school's problem at that point. But to save you all the difficulty of having to deal with all of that, it's always better to be unambiguous in the way that you're communicating stuff. So I am requesting formally an evaluation. I think my student is eligible for an IEP or might be eligible. I would like to request an IEP eligibility evaluation. And then the school's response, if they've done their homework, should be, okay, cool, let's get that set up. And they should be talking about who needs to be involved in that, whether there's school providers, outside providers, anybody who might have expertise in one or more areas the student is suspected to have needs in. So that's something you should also remember when you're setting up an initial evaluation, is make sure the school has actually identified all of the areas of concern that you have. If your student is struggling in reading, but also in behavior, you want to make sure that both of those areas get evaluated. Even if the student is struggling like mostly in one area and, maybe just having a little bit of concerns in another area, make sure that every area of need is appropriately evaluated and that you actually have somebody who is the right kind of professional to be able to interpret that information. It's no good to have somebody who, you wouldn't go to a spine doctor to deal with your foot issue or whatever. You need to make sure that, just the same in a psychological context, like if you're evaluating somebody in these academic areas, you want to go to a psychologist who has expertise in those specific academic areas. And oftentimes this is done in-house with the school district people, so you don't really get much of a say for the initial evaluation, but it can come into play later on if you request an independent evaluation. I think that was on one of the slides earlier. If you disagree with an evaluation, you can request an independent evaluation at the school district's expense. It's at no cost to you. All you have to do is email the administrators and say, I disagree with my student's evaluation, and I'm requesting an independent education evaluation at public expense. Those are the magic words. And you can only do that once the student has already been evaluated, though. So if the student has been evaluated and you disagree with the evaluation, or they've not been found eligible and you think, man, that's nonsense, this kid absolutely is eligible, you can challenge that without having to sue or go through an administrative proceeding by requesting an independent evaluation. And that is supposed to be done through an independent provider with no connection to the school district. And they provide a report of their findings about the student that are supposed to be uncorrupted by any interference by the school district. And they will say, this is what we think about this kid. So that's pretty much like the first line of defense if you have an eligibility or enrollment or evaluation issue, is to request an IEE. That often I've found I've been able to get out of some disputes with school districts just by doing that, by showing like, look, this isn't just us being annoying. This is, clinical professionals have found that this is the case. We are not just doing this to make your lives miserable or anything like that, okay, fine, maybe we'll consider doing this. So that can be really helpful. But yes, it's really important that they evaluate all areas of suspected need. So that was kind of the through line there. And make sure that they follow through with it as well. If you request an evaluation, this is also why you should do things in writing. If you request an evaluation and you're told, okay, we're going to get those evaluations started, we're going to have, Mrs. So-and-so from the psychology department come down on Wednesday and do this reading test, then you should follow through and make sure that actually happened. If your kid comes home and is like, I didn't do any tests, then like, what gives? Why are we not doing the testing? Let's make this happen. Like, they're supposed to do it within a reasonable period of time. So, and then, assuming all of those tests go through and are done well, the school will provide you with their determination whether or not they think the student is eligible for an IEP, which again is supposed to be based on whether they think they require specially designed instruction. And so make note of anything the school points to that doesn't have to do with the student's need for specially designed instruction. If they say something like, well, we're just not going to provide an IEP, like your student might require some special ed, but we're not going to do that because at our school, we don't provide IEPs for students who don't have an intellectual disability. This is something that I was actually told in a case that I later brought to a due process hearing, which was successful here in Utah. A student who had chronic pain and a number of other conditions was basically told, we don't do IEPs for kids who don't have intellectual disabilities, and so we're not even going to evaluate you, basically. They were later found to be in violation of the IDEA. They denied the student a free appropriate public education because they failed to conduct an appropriate evaluation, basically. So the evaluation is really important, and you should definitely be very vigilant as that is going on, in case you should need to challenge that later on. And especially in the case of chronic pain, like I said at the beginning, I bring up that example, not just randomly, but because that is kind of the stereotype. People think special ed, they think, okay, this is a kid who has intellectual disabilities and needs X, Y, and Z kind of accommodation. They have this particular image in their head of what special education means, and that's just not accurate. Basically, it's an inaccurate and outdated idea of what special education means. Special education is not just for kids with intellectual disabilities. It can be very useful for kids with intellectual disabilities, but it is for anybody who requires specially designed instruction in order to make progress in line with their individual circumstances. So yeah, I think that gets everything I wanted to cover there.
I mean, that was a very long-winded answer. I mean, fantastic. But I also think that case that you had happens more often than any of us would actually like to admit. That I think a lot of our families do hear that. Well, they don't exactly fit into one of these categories, even though that's what the other health impairment is used for. But I think they often hear, no, they don't qualify for that reason. And it's like, no, that's not the reason for them not to qualify. So I'm glad you were able to show that school district that they were wrong, though, and how that can benefit that child. So how can families communicate effectively, though, with the school to ensure that the child's the IEP is tailored to their specific needs? As I kind of mentioned earlier, it's not like blanket answers, right, for everybody. That different people have different conditions, have different learning styles and things. And for all of our families, they're all going to be kind of different. How can our parents and families and caregivers really effectively communicate to the schools for that?
Of course, yeah. So the thing that comes to mind for me is you sort of get a sense of how to speak school admin-ese over a while. There are certain ways of talking about things that I find are more likely to get through to people. And hopefully you shouldn't need to, do any of this snake charmer stuff because it's very annoying. And it's much better to have people who are just willing to listen to you at the outset, should be obvious. So assuming all is well and good, hopefully your initial request goes smoothly, they take you seriously, they take your child's needs seriously, and they move forward with evaluations and all is well and good. Oftentimes that is not the case, however, and the thing that I find is most helpful is to just emphasize that this is a need that we're talking about. I like to be very unequivocal about the fact that if I'm advocating for something in a student's IEP, this is something that this student needs in order to benefit from their education. This is non-negotiable, basically. Like, my student, in order to actually show up and not like be in severe and chronic pain on the floor the entire day, actually requires this support and service so that they can go to school and learn and also maintain their health and not have to worry about serious health conditions, or my student actually needs this support in order to be able to achieve any sort of benefit, in the realm of special education, especially, if you have a student who's super far behind and needs specially designed instruction, my student is not obtaining anything, any sort of benefit from this curriculum that's being taught. It's in one ear and out the other. It's completely not on their level. It's not targeted or individualized to their needs. And this student actually needs an individualized education. This education they are currently being provided is as good as nothing, basically. So as much as we hate dealing in absolutes, this is one of those situations where I find that it is actually somewhat warranted to speak in terms of absolutes. My student cannot benefit from their education without this. This is a requirement. This is something that my student needs. And I find that this actually kind of breaks through that bootstrap mentality, like, oh, well, you're just trying to get something that everybody else hasn't got because you don't want to work as hard as everybody else. Like, no, we are willing to work as hard as everybody else. We're going to do that. And also, in order to even be able to work as hard as everyone else, we need these supports, basically. I also find the more people you're able to talk to is better. It's a problem we often encounter here in Utah is that the schools are organized in a very top-down sort of way. Like, administrators really want to make sure that everybody is on the same page and that nobody disagrees with each other at the IEP from the school side. And so you get these IEPs where you can tell that everybody besides the parent has been talking, and colluding behind closed doors, and they've already made up their mind about what they're going to do. It's very difficult to get around that. If the school has made up their mind, come hell or high water, they're probably going to move forward with what it is they've decided. So to the extent that you can get around that, if you can get on, if you have a teacher who you communicate effectively with that you feel like is on your side, talk to them early and often, express your concerns, ask them if they would be willing to say certain things. Like, if they make an observation, like, I think that the student did really well when we tried this particular modality. Great, could you say that at the IEP meeting? Because like oftentimes, the way that we tell whether an IEP is individualized is whether or not the IEP team members who actually made the IEP took into account the student's individual needs, as opposed to something else like, oh, this is just our district policy or whatever. The IEP, every single aspect of the IEP has to be based on the student's individual needs. And so, like I said earlier, it can't be based on, this is our policy or we just don't do things this way. If a student requires something to benefit from their education, that is something that they're entitled to be provided. And so the opinion of experts and specialists in any area is always going to be valuable. If you have, more specific areas of concern, like if you've got a student who has, speech issues and works with a speech pathologist, get that speech pathologist to come and say the thing that you want them to say. The school is going to listen to their own experts, hopefully, even if they aren't going to listen. I mean, they should listen to you too. Like, they should be listening to the parent. They're legally required to, but if they're not going to listen to the parent, at very least, hopefully they will listen to their own experts. So you can also, even if it's not somebody who is formally part of the IEP team, you can get an outside expert. Like, your kid has a therapist who's really good, who really knows your student and who they feel really comfortable talking with. This is especially good for kids who have behavior concerns. If that person is willing to come to the IEP meeting and talk on your behalf, they can do that. Actually, the IDEA says that anybody who has special knowledge or expertise about a student and can contribute that knowledge or expertise to the IEP team conversation, they're actually able to be brought to the IEP meeting. And so even if they're not the teacher or somebody who's affiliated with the school or anybody that's even associated with the school at all, you have the ability to do that. And you can contact your administrator and say, I'm going to bring this person, they're going to talk about this, and definitely let them know in advance. So expertise, I think, would be the kind of core thing to remember there. if you have somebody who can vouch for you and can say, this isn't just my preference, this is the data actually supports this. Some of us have the benefit of working in a field that, is related to psychology, and you can actually make some of those arguments, more yourself. If you can, I would definitely encourage you to do so. But most people are not going to be in that position. So you get an expert to come and interpret that data, and if you disagree with something, if somebody is going to interpret a psych eval, and they have their expert there and you disagree, you can get your own expert to come and look at that and provide their own conclusions. And all of that gets recorded. If you are, as I would highly recommend as well, record all of your IEP meetings. You can do that in Utah. You don't have to mention, I don't know about the other states, you'll have to check your local laws about what that looks like. In Utah, you don't have to mention that you're recording an IEP meeting, you can just do it. And I highly recommend that people do that. And yeah, then if later on, if you need to go to dispute resolution, you can say like, look, we had this IEP meeting, the school had clearly made up their mind. I brought an expert that said this is not appropriate for this student. As a matter of fact, this is actually what they need instead. They were ignored. It was like they weren't even there, and the school moved forward with what they were going to do originally. That is how you prove predetermination, which is one of the violations that you can point to under the IDEA. So come with your best arguments. You shouldn't have to be in that position, but oftentimes you will be. And if you need backup, you have backup, and you are entitled to bring that with you. I think that's my best advice for you.
That makes a lot of sense. Be prepared. Come ready to fight for what is right for your own child. So, so in a perfect world where we've now gotten our IEP and we're navigating, through the school years, as we're moving from one school year to the next, any advice as, we transition grade levels and in terms of updating and altering the IEP?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question. So the key, and I think kind of the keystone of the entire special education law, like I said earlier, we're talking about, people with disabilities can and do succeed if they're provided with the right supports. Hand in hand with that notion is this concept of appropriate progress. This phrase comes from the Supreme Court. Actually, I encourage you to read it if you have the stomach for this sort of thing, because it is helpful. Actually, I think even to a non-legal observer, if you have a student with a disability, to understand kind of like what the courts are thinking about. So this case is called Andrew. It's not Andrew with an A, but E, Andrew. Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District. Went to the Supreme Court, and it was actually a unanimous decision, which is very rare in this day and age. 8-0, one of the judges, I forget who, recused themselves. But we get this idea of appropriate progress and a reasonably calculated IEP. And these are legalese terms. So to translate that into normal people speak, reasonably calculated means it's individualized. It's individualized based on the student's particular specific needs. And appropriate progress means the progress that we could expect of that student if they're provided with all the supports that they need in order to make progress. So, that is very important to keep in mind, that we're measuring things based on a student's individual progress. So the example I like to use is if you had a student who had a reading level that was pretty far behind, we're not basing things on whether the student is at grade level. We're basing it on whether we think the student can be or should be at grade level at a particular point in time. So for many students who are testing at grade level, we are going to be using the grade level standards as a benchmark. For students who are not at grade level, though, oftentimes we're not going to be, if you have a student who's in 10th grade and is reading at a second grade reading level, in most cases, it's not realistic to expect that they're going to go from a second grade reading level all the way up to a 10th grade reading level in the course of a single school year. It could happen. I wouldn't discount that as a possibility, but in most cases, that's not what we're going to be looking at. So what that means, though, is that if we think a reasonable expectation of progress for this student in a certain period of time, like let's say a year, we think this student can go from second grade reading level to third grade, and we think that's an appropriate level of progress based on the experts, based on the data. We think that is, if this student gets all the support they need, we think that would be a good level of progress. We think that's appropriate. That is the benchmark that we are using to determine whether or not a student is receiving the benefit they're entitled to under the law, as if their education has been individualized in such a way that it allows them to make that progress that we expect of them assuming they're provided with their needs, basically. So what that means is that the progress that a student is making from benchmark to benchmark, some schools like to do it from, they might do it just once a year. I strongly recommend, if you are able to do this, that you have more benchmarks than that. IEP goals are really designed to be checked more frequently than once every year. And I don't think that they really do their job when they're only reviewed once a year, like some school districts will do. So the goals are very important. So every IEP, it's all interlinked, basically. So every IEP is going to identify areas of concern. So let's say reading, writing, and behavior, as areas of concern, or it could be speech and occupational therapy and something else, whatever the areas of concern are, every single area needs to have goals associated with it. So if you have a deficit in math and you're working on math with a special ed teacher, you better have a goal in that area, and you better have service minutes in those areas. So every area of need is going to have a goal. And the way that we can tell if an IEP is doing its job, if a student is receiving a benefit, is whether they're making progress on their goals. If they're not making progress on their goals as expected, either the IEP itself is not appropriate for them, or the goals that we have set out for them are not the right goals to be able to actually accurately measure their progress. And so the reason I say so, using the grade level example again, just because that's, straightforward, if we're reading and it's usually more specific. So, if John will read a, third grade level text at, 50 words per minute with a maximum of, 9 mistakes, as measured by 6 out of 7, that's a really weird number, sure, 6 out of 7 observations, over the course of a school year, so if we're, at the present level is, let's say we're at 20 words per minute, we're trying to get up to 50, halfway through the year, we should be halfway to that goal. And I just realized I used really terrible numbers for that, so I'm going to revise that. So I'm going to say 20 and 80, basically. So 80 minus 20 is 60. My math is very much not good, but I'm going to trust that's true. Half of that would be 30, basically. And so we're going to be expecting that halfway through the school year, the student should be about halfway through that goal. And so that's why the benchmarks are important, is, you should be able to look. And if your student comes home and says, Mom, I'm having Dad, I'm having a really hard time in school. I just don't know how to, do the multiplication tables, or, whatever it is. And you can go through and say, yeah, this goal, we were supposed to be working on this. We're not even close to making progress on this goal. You can call an IEP team meeting, which you can do at any time, by the way. And you can say, we're not making targets. We haven't met progress on this goal. And either this goal is too ambitious, or, it's just not realistic, or the services aren't working. We need to come up with something else. So, let's have that conversation as a team. The transition from grade to grade can also be kind of a sticking point. It's always good to, talk to your child's teacher and make sure, especially in those transitions between like elementary to middle to high school, that if the environment and the sort of format of school is going to be different, to make sure that your kid knows what's expected of them, where to go, what to do, and those sorts of things, but also to familiarize yourself with who it is you're going to need to talk to if there's problems that come up. Make sure you have, contact information for all of the teachers, anybody you might, interact with, members of the IEP team, service providers, administrators. It's, critical to know your IEP team and know who they are, and to, be able to speak to the right people, if you should need to, basically. So the most important thing to circle back around is that if your child is not making progress, and you can tell based on their goals that they're not making progress, that is the time when you should be calling an IEP meeting and saying, here's our evidence, we're not making progress. What are we going to do to address this problem? And what are we going to do to address this problem now, rather than waiting for an entire school year for them to fall further and further behind without getting the appropriate supports that they need, basically.
Like it's don't wait. That's the message. Don't wait.
That's
Don't
right.
wait. Ask for those meetings. We're getting close to time. Casey's going to jump into our Q&A, and we have some questions for you. So Casey, I'm going to hand it over to you. And just while Casey does this, I'm throwing extra information into the chat for anybody support docs. I'm also going to sign up for the other webinars into the chat for people on. So.
Um, so I'm gonna kind of shorten some of these questions. Some of them are lengthy, and so I just wanted to shorten some of them in saying that for a teenager, a high school junior that has already qualified for an IEP, the school has reluctantly agreed to certain migraine-related accommodations, such as access to a nurse, restroom, water, and snacks, but absolutely refuses to include that she is not penalized for absences or tardies resulting from her disability. And this has now intimidated the student to the level that they are unwilling to miss class, often resulting in migraine attacks escalating. How would you kind of handle that situation?
So that would be a problem under either an IEP or a Section 504 plan. So that would be what I would, what it sounds like to me is that's a reasonable accommodation that's been requested. Like, we're not going to be penalized for tardies when they're clearly associated with the student's disability. They're refusing to allow that as an accommodation. So that would be an issue under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and possibly also the Americans with Disabilities Act. It could also potentially be a problem under the IDEA, the IEP law, if that prevents the student from accessing their educational program. But in this case, it sounds to me like it's more of that civil rights kind of issue. The student is essentially being discriminated against because they have a disability that makes it so that they can't avoid being tardy sometimes. And also, it sounds like there's anxiety associated with that as well. So in that sort of situation, that is when I would recommend, if you haven't, assuming you've kind of exhausted the typical avenues of, making your requests formally and in writing, you've been told no, all these different things. That's kind of what I am picking up on here. That would be a complaint to the Office for Civil Rights. They have an administrative complaint procedure where you can, that is pretty straightforward to access. There's an online form, and you can also do it more traditionally, fill out a letter and send it into them. But the online form works pretty well, I think, for folks. That would be a situation where, you would basically be alleging that, like, my student has a disability. Other kids are not treated this way. Other kids are able to make it, to class without being tardy. And yet my student, because they have a disability, are going to be essentially penalized for something that's entirely outside of their control. Is this, this is discrimination, this is not legal. And, the Department of Education, the OCR, which is under Department of Education, they then will take the time to determine if they think there is a potential violation. If they think there's been a violation, they'll open up an investigation. And within a certain amount of time, they will let you know whether they found violations and order the school district to engage in corrective action if they have violated the law. But yeah, I mean, from the sound of it, that does sound like the sort of circumstance where I think the, making use of the civil rights provisions of federal law would be appropriate. Like I said, I do think that you could theoretically bring that as a state complaint under the IDEA, which would be like, the IEP version of that, where you're saying, not necessarily my student's been discriminated against, but their education falls short of what is required for them. It's not individualized. It's not allowing them to make appropriate progress. It's not reasonably calculated, like we said earlier. You could theoretically make that argument, but I don't see it being quite as strong in that kind of side of things.
Yeah.
So I know Maya just mentioned the Office of Civil Rights, the OCR, which also came up like in the question that was asked. And as I mentioned earlier, as we are gathering the information about other organizations like yours, Maya, and all the other states, we are also putting together all the OCR information. So depending on where you are in the country, you're going to have an office that is specific to you. And all of that will be on the Migraine at School website come January. And I'm sure we could probably get the Pediatric Warrior page to link to that information so that all of our families can easily find that information. I just wanted to make that note.
That's fabulous. Yes.
Of course we will link to that. And it's just such a wealth of information. So yes. So we have another question on here that says, I have a meeting tomorrow. And I also, do you have time to answer a few more questions? I know we
Yeah.
are
Oh, yeah.
at clock. I want to be, we are so appreciative of your time, but there were just a few questions. So if you need to jump, we can. I just wanted to ask if that's okay.
All well and good.
Okay. And for individuals, if you do need to jump off, this is being recorded. So you can get the recording of this if you have to leave as well. But so somebody just wrote, I have a meeting tomorrow. My high schooler has an IEP and a 504. I feel like we had a good plan till recently. She has been having more severe symptoms, and since she's in an accelerated program, when she misses school, the makeup work is really hard to catch up. Recently, we had issues getting notes from peers and a teacher. I've also been told that due to her missing so much school, we need to go with part-time homebound. I've emailed the team to let them know that I want to add a scribe to her plan. My question is, what else do you think I should ask for? And is homebound an extreme action at this time?
Okay, yeah, no, that is definitely a tricky situation to be in. So I guess I would start by saying, um, I I usually am cautious about recommending specific types of interventions for students just because that's something that really needs to come from an educational expert in that particular area. I can speak to like what's legal and what's not legal, but it's difficult for me to say, like what specific types of interventions might be appropriate in that situation. However, I would say that in general, kind of to answer the question about homebound, um, homebound is considered to be the most restrictive placement that is possible under the law. And I didn't mention this earlier because it didn't come up, but students, in addition to being entitled to an education which is individualized, they also have the right to receive that education in what's called the least restrictive environment. And that means that to the extent a student is separated from other kids, whether that's kids with disabilities or any kids at all, to the extent that that student is separated, that separation occurs only insofar as that student needs to be separated in order to receive an educational benefit, make appropriate progress. So that, in other words, they shouldn't be excluded purely due to lack of resources, or this is just how we do things, or, things of that nature. So when I hear, a school saying, because your kid is missing so much school, you need to go on homebound, that raises red flags for me because it's saying like you could make that decision not knowing anything about the student. If student X is missing this amount of time, we're going to refer them for homebound. We don't know anything about this kid other than they're missing a lot of school and they have an IEP. So like, I would say, yes, it probably does sound like an extreme action, especially if they haven't tried anything less restrictive than that, because homebound is the most restrictive placement that exists. You don't have access to any other peers at all, disabled or otherwise. It's more restrictive, legally speaking, than being like in a residential facility, which is surprising to some people, but that's how it is, because even in a facility, there's other kids that are there. But at home, other than your siblings, I guess there's no there's no peers there whatsoever. So it's the most restricted placement possible. If a school is going to be proposing that a student needs to go on homebound, they better have a really good reason for that. If the student needs a homebound placement because they're just not learning at all, and being in the classroom is too taxing on them, and they're not able to succeed, and it's just clearly not beneficial for their health, that's one thing. But like, the school is saying, we think your kid is struggling, they should probably go to homebound because they're missing a lot of school. Like, not necessarily. Like, if that were the right thing for the student, sure. But like, we don't know that that's the right thing for this particular student. We don't know like if other things have been tried, if less restrictive means have been attempted or considered. At very least, they don't have to attempt everything and fail, but they do have to meaningfully consider other options. So I would say that like, yeah, anything that you feel like would allow your student to stay around and be in class and make it tolerable and not have to go home, assuming that is what they want, that's something that I would request. And a lot of those things are probably going to be accommodations. Maybe some of those things are going to be specially designed instruction. But I would emphasize that like, you know, in an IEP meeting, you know, if I'm in your perspective, I don't believe that my child needs to be at home in order to benefit from their education. As a matter of fact, I think that if we had these things, that my student would succeed and would make progress. So let's talk about getting these things.
Mhm.
So, you know, I know that's not answering the question in terms of, you know, like what sort of things would you want to ask for, but that's like how I would go about doing it. You know, if it's between having to be at home all the time with no access to peers, there better be a pretty good justification for that level of restriction, you know, and it better be based on the student's individual needs.
Exactly. And I know Casey and I would both say that one of the last things that we want to see in the pain community is another one of our children isolated because of their pain. And, you know, when we put a student in a position where then they're forced to go to school at home, it's just okay, well now they're isolated even more. And there is this whole cyclical cycle of it can actually increase the pain. So I think that that was a really good answer, Maya. That, you know, and I don't think I understood too that that would be categorized as the most restrictive scenario. So again, yeah, that I would say that um, thinking of what else does your child need? You know, you meant I know that she mentioned something about getting a scribe, but you know, advocate then you know it's probably not best for your child to be homebound. So appreciate that.
Completely agree. I mean, the mental health aspect, I mean, take away all the pain complications that come with it, but the mental health aspect of just them being home is, and away from peers and already then feeling different is so much worse. But I think from families we hear often is that it is the school district, it's almost them taking the easy way out of being like, oh, we're just going to homebound you because then you can sleep in, you can do things at your leisure, and not really taking into the account like all the needs of that child and just how important school is um, for individuals. And I think sometimes us as parents have to really advocate that no, school is so important for these reasons. Um, so another question that we have here, we have also seen significant knowledge gaps related to transition goals, resulting in refusals to address in transition, especially for annual goals in support of transition for academic self advocacy, as well as independent living related to following a treatment plan, including awareness, acting at onset. What have you seen that has been effective of transition goals?
Okay, yeah. The so transition, and again, I think this probably differs state to state. At least here in Utah, this is like one of the most like we're pretty far behind, I think, in the area of transition. So and when we say transition, for those who are listening at home, we're talking about services to help a student who is graduating from high school go on and, you know, transition to the next part of their life, whether that's going to school, like secondary education, or whether they're going to independent living or employment. Every student in every state is entitled to services to help them with transition to independent living and adulthood at the age of 16. Some states have made it lower. Actually, in Utah, it's 14 is when you start being eligible for transition services. So the question, though, being, you know, what have you seen that's effective? It really depends on what the student wants to do, but I would say that, like, you know, the kind of typical transition IEP is going to include a lot of vocational training or education, like support to get the student ready for education if they're going to be moving on to college, basically. So depending on those two things, if it's, you know, if it's college, you want to be talking early and often to the students, like school counselors, if there's advisors, you know, if your student has a particular place that they want to go, there's often, you know, they have disability offices at these local places. You know, you can sometimes even get folks like that to come to an IEP meeting. It really depends on who you can talk to, but the school is really supposed to be kind of taking charge of a lot of these things. You know, for a student who is going into to employment straight out of school, you know, you want to be looking at vocational rehab. States have VR offices, which are basically services similar to special education in school. You can also get employment services for being a person with a disability who's trying to get access to competitive employment. And you can receive what's called an IPE, Individualized Plan for Employment, which is similar, of course, to an IEP. They keep all the acronyms as confusing as possible to make sure you're paying attention, I guess. But the law actually says that a VR counselor, voc rehab counselor, is supposed to be invited to all IEP meetings after the student becomes eligible for transition services. So if your student is the age where they are eligible for transition services, ask your school admin, like, what is our plan to get the VR counselor to show up to our next meeting? Because we need to start talking about a transition goal. The biggest thing is what the student wants and, you know, what they actually have the initiative to be able to go forward. Because like, it's all well and good that we put together, you know, a wonderful transition goal that, you know, sets the student up to, you know, go on for a career in, you know, whatever. But if the student doesn't actually want to do that, and they're never going to actually follow through with that, then it's useless, basically. So it starts by asking the student, you know, what do you want to do, you know, after school? You know, what happens after you graduate? Is there a particular job that you want to do? And for some kids, that's going to be very, like, they've been thinking about it their whole life and they know exactly what they want to be when they grow up. I was not that kid when I was in that situation. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And a lot of kids, I think, are in that situation. So sometimes services are helping the student figure out what they want to do. And I think that for students who don't have a very clear understanding of what they want to go into, that's going to be the biggest and, you know, most important step. I've personally seen and witnessed the difference that is made between a student who is working on skills that they feel are actually meaningful, that they think are beneficial, that they actually get some sort of inherent enjoyment out of, versus kids who are just going through the motions because they know they're going to get grounded if they go home and, you know, they get another parent call home or something like that. You know, it's like night and day. I've been in IEP meetings where, like, we had, I still remember this one where we had a kid who was you know, a teenager, and you know, he just didn't want to go to school. The problem was even getting him to show up. You know, he would elope from class and he didn't want to be in class. If he was in class, he would, you know, be in the hallway within like 2 seconds. And, you know, we were trying to come up with, the IEP team trying to come up with literally anything to get this student just to, like, be interested in anything education related so that we could get him on a transition goal of some sort. And we were sitting there talking and talking, you know, and the student was actually there. Something that you can do is your student, if they're old enough, can be at their own IEP meeting, although that depends on the situation. But, you know, this kid was just like, I don't want to do it. I hate school, you know, and just offhand when we were in that meeting, I just heard him make some sort of comment about like, I would rather be playing video games. And I was thinking, like, okay, so this kid likes video games, basically. And so when it came, you know, when we were talking about transition, I basically said, like, hey, school admins, do you guys have any coding classes? Can this kid learn how to write code in Python or something like that? And, you know, maybe help him learn how to design video games. Is that something you'd be interested in? And the kid was like, well, sure, yeah. I don't think that's something they do here. Turns out it was. They actually had a coding class that this kid was able to do like in after school hours. And he went and did that, and it was actually really good. His parent told me that like got him into the school building. He had something he was interested in. He stuck with it, and I haven't had to go to any more IEP meetings for them. So I think that's usually the best sign, is when, you know, somebody, if I don't end up having to get involved again, you know, usually I like to think, hopefully, you know, things are going a little bit better. But like, it was really just that. It was like the student had an interest in programming, you know, and that was literally all. The only thing that it took to be able to get the student even to show up to school was like, well, yeah, I got to go to my coding class. So he did. So anyway, too many transition IEPs don't actually ask the student what they want to do when they're growing up. And I think that's a huge problem.
That was really thinking outside the box, though, and kudos to you for doing that. I know that this is a question that I hear so often and encountered with my own son, is that they are passing, they're doing great in school, so they actually don't need any accommodations, even though they qualify for them, or that they can't or should not be in like honors or AP classes with accommodations for, I know the answer because like I said, I went through this with my own kid, but I do think that it is important because we hear this from so many different individuals that
Mhm.
their kid, just because they're passing at grade level, does not need these accommodations, or that they can't be in accelerated classes. And that was literally what the lady told us is, well, he's passing, so we don't need to make any accommodations. And
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it illustrates the sort of two ways I think that things can go wrong. Obviously, there's more than two ways, but two very kind of specific ways, I think. Yeah, so this is one of those places where it's really important to understand the distinction between the IDEA and IEPs and the Rehab Act, Section 504, basically. So again, 504, we're dealing with civil rights accommodations. IEP and IDEA, we're dealing with special education. If your student is, really far ahead and is making progress on all of their academic goals, that may or may not mean that they do not qualify for an IEP. What that doesn't mean is it doesn't have anything to do with their accommodations under the civil rights laws, basically. So, whether if your student doesn't need special ed and is making progress and is in AP classes and is doing just fine, then they might not qualify for an IEP. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they qualify for accommodations under 504, basically. So all you need to do to be qualified for 504 accommodations is to be a person with a disability. That's literally it, basically. And to be trying to, and the agency that you're talking to receives federal money, which all public schools do. So every public school is subject to this, essentially. So it's not true that a student who is doing well and making appropriate academic progress, they are somehow ineligible for accommodations, because accommodations are designed to allow you to receive the same an educational benefit that is as adequate as what is provided to non-disabled people. It's intended to put you on an equal footing, not to actually change the content of what you're receiving. And so AP classes, it does not matter. You have students who are in AP class. If you have a student who is in an AP class and needs accommodations, is it a reasonable accommodation? Do they have a disability? Okay, that's it, basically. Yes, they're entitled to that and you have to provide it, basically. Whether or not a student, yeah, so like essentially I would just have to know like what went wrong in that administrator's training. Are they thinking that a student who is ahead of the curve in terms of their academics is somehow not eligible for any sort of accommodations? Like, as though being the smartest kid in the entire world would make you stop needing a wheelchair to get around if you used a wheelchair, It's the same
That's
idea.
a great example. I love that example.
I
Because
can tell
it's
you for
tangible.
my son, it was visually impaired, and they were like, they don't have to make the accommodations. He's an honor roll student, and the judge looked at them and was like, maybe he's a high honor roll student if we gave him the accommodations that he needed. And I will say he did graduate high honor. So obviously, when you do give somebody the tools that they need, that they can go that extra mile. So
Excellent.
yes. I'm just making sure. I think
Yeah, I think that the people that are in the Q&A, I have reached out to everyone and given
perfect.
them my email address. So if there's anything further that they need, like they can reach out. I've
Okay.
also said that I will help them find their Mayas locally.
Yes, absolutely. Reach out to, we mentioned at the beginning, but so I work for the Disability Law Center of Utah, which is a protection and advocacy agency. There is one in every state and the territories as well. And there's also one on the Navajo Nation down in the Four Corners region. I actually was just down there working with them just a couple weeks ago. But whatever state you live in, there is a disability law center. The trick is figuring out what they're called because they're all called something different. We are actually just called Disability Law Center, so I have to specify of Utah because we are not every state's disability law center. That's just our name. So you can look up Disability Law Center. Some states are called disability rights states, like Disability Rights Colorado and Disability Rights California are two that I know of. But
we've noticed
Amy
that
is
the
going to,
names are
they're
slightly
really
different.
confusing. So Amy is going to get you some information on what the exact name of the P&A, Protection and Advocacy Agency, is for your state. And we're free legal services. Every P&A, we're law firms that provide free legal services to people with disabilities living within our jurisdiction. So I help people in Utah, of course. and your local PNA can help you in whatever state you live in.
Yes, absolutely. So please, anybody, people that I've already told that they can reach out to me, anybody watching this, please, I'm easy to find on the Migraine at School website. Please feel free to email and we will get you the information that you need to reach out to, again, your Maya locally. So Maya, just again, we cannot thank you enough. Your bringing your expertise to this conversation has been invaluable. My understanding has increased significantly over our two conversations, and I know that this resource will benefit so many families that we serve and these kids that are living with these invisible sort of, these illnesses. So again, information in the chat, resources. But with that, we're just want to hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And again, Casey, if you want to just, couple last words, just again, Maya, thank you.
Yes,
First,
I just want to echo everything Amy said. Thank you so much for not just tonight, but even last month as well. And your knowledge is just so invaluable to all of our families, and you might just get a whole bunch of families who are moving to Utah because we know where you are and now they all feel comfortable with you. So sorry about that if that happens. But I just want to make sure that all of our families know that while Maya is such an amazing resource, that to always remember, like, you guys are not in this fight alone. I don't think Amy and I can say this enough. And I think we always say this to our families, is that you're not on this journey alone, and utilize Amy and myself as well as Maya if you happen to be in Utah, or whoever else that Maya is, and realize that you're not alone in these battles. I have walked this battle. I know Amy has, as a mom, has walked this battle as well. And we truly are here to help you on that journey. And always believe in yourself, but more importantly, believe in your child and stand up for your child, because you do know what's best more than the school does, and more than what the school thinks they do. You do know your child. And never stop believing in them, and just see what a difference that will make as well. So I just kind of wanted to end on that, and just say thank you again. And to everyone who stuck out with us for the hour and a half, I really appreciate all of you being on here, and look forward to seeing you guys next month, and have a wonderful holiday.
wonderful. Yeah. A happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And again, Maya, thank you. And with that, we'll let everybody go and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Alrighty, thank you for the opportunity once again, and yeah, enjoy your evening.
Thank you, everybody. Good
Thanks.
night.